They thought they could erase me from their perfect life. When my daughter and her husband pushed me out, they didn't realize the truth I'd buried could shatter everything they believed. I stayed silent, watching, planning, until the day I turned their world inside out without ever raising my voice. The envelope looked like every other family invitation I had received over the years. It was polite, neat, and wrapped in the kind of warmth that pretends everything is fine. I opened it while standing at the kitchen sink, the late afternoon light making the paper look softer than it was. They had chosen to celebrate something small, a housewarming or an anniversary, something that should have been ordinary. Instead, it felt like a test. I read their names and the location, then the line that cut like a cold wind. No parents, please. The handwriting was careful, almost clinical. That line landed in me and did not leave. I did not react in front of the child I raised. I folded the invitation and tucked it away like one tucks away a bruise. They would come and go from my life, carrying their new furniture, new lives, a new set of rules that I had not been consulted on. I stayed home and made tea as if nothing had changed, as if the small domestic rituals could armor me from being uninvited. I watched the lights along the street through the window and felt a strange detachment. The house that had raised her and the house that now wanted to exclude me existed on the same map, but different territories. The odd thing was the way my mind moved beyond the slight. I cataloged memories like one catalogs items for an inventory. Her first birthday, the scraped knee she refused to tell anyone about, the nights she crawled into my bed after thunderstorms. Those memories were mine by right, not by permission. The invitation's sharpness awakened a quiet calculation. Not out of spite at first, but out of a growing resolve. I would not be quietly erased. I would not be made invisible in the life I had built. That night, I slept lightly, like someone listening for footsteps. I dreamed in fragments, a door closing, the sound of glasses clinking, laughter a half step ahead of cruelty. When I woke, the plan was not yet formed. There was only a slow, clear thought that I would not play the part of the abandoned parent. I would not be the person who steals pity or wields pain like a badge. I wanted something else, something that left them unprepared, something that rebalanced the ledger without spectacle. I wanted a truth that landed like a mirror. The next move would be subtle. It would be a quiet retribution that fit the shape of their arrogance. I began by listening to the silence where their invitation had been. I started going where they went, not as an invited guest, but as an orderly presence in the margins. I learned to read their patterns like a map. Shopping lists revealed tastes. Social media revealed curated delight and edited family moments. Their neighborly routines gave away the times they ate, the places they shopped, the weekends they were likely to be away. I never confronted them openly. I pretended that I was indifferent, that their exclusion was a trivial matter. People who exclude others rarely imagine those excluded are watching closely. There was a strange power in becoming invisible. I could see things they assumed no one else would notice. I noticed the way the daughter smoothed her hair before passing my house, the way the husband checked his phone as if waiting for validation. I watched how they hosted. Crisp napkins, perfect playlists, laughter that landed on cue. Their world was polished, designed to reflect success and belonging. The more I observed, the clearer their brittle edges became. They were not cruel people by some easy measure. They were less dangerous when they were simply thoughtless, and more dangerous when pride guided them. I started small. A dropped flyer, a gentle rearrangement of a plant near their gate, tiny disturbances with no obvious source. Each small nudge felt like testing the water, seeing if anyone noticed that the world could be slightly off. No one did. The effect was intoxicating. It proved that their lives were held together by convenience and assumptions, not by the sturdier threads of empathy. At night, I played over conversations in my head and rewrote them, letting silence be a character in the scenes I imagined. My daughter had always loved puzzles. She had been delighted by secrets when she was small. Somewhere along the way, she had learned to prefer the slyness of secrets that raised her own profile and erased the complexities of where she came from. That erased history had become the seed of my plan. There is a certain cruelty in secrets. The truth behaves like an animal that wants to be free. I began to consider how the truth about her beginnings could be used, not to humiliate at a party, but to shift the axis of how they saw themselves and where they found their strength. I collected evidence of their arrogance like one collects postcards. Small, colorful tokens of how they wanted the world to think of them. Each one would become a linchpin in a story that would unsettle, softly but persistently. Memories are strange vessels. Some are fragile, some are heavy as stones. She had come into my life without fanfare, with an astonished look and a hunger for stories. I remembered every small dawn and midnight as if they were carved into my skin. Her first steps had been across the cracked kitchen tiles. Her first temper tantrum had ended with 2 cups on the floor and a stubborn silence. Those moments were mine and theirs, braided together. I held on to a particular photograph, a small black and white print that had been tucked into a box of old bills. It showed her at 3, a smudge of jam at the corner of her mouth, eyes alive and wide. I kept it hidden because it was proof of a life that predated their neat narratives. The photograph became a talisman. When the invitation arrived, I touched its corners and felt a small, unaccountable rage rise. Not violent, but cold and precise. The truth in that picture was not only about lineage. It was about belonging built out of ordinary acts, making breakfasts, drying tears, staying up with feverish bodies. Those acts were not glamorous. They were the material of a life. The photograph would one day become a hinge. I did not know exactly how, but I knew the truth would not be loud and theatrical. It would not be used to shout. It would be used to make them notice the seams in the story they had created. I began to plan a sequence where memory would be the medium of revelation. It would be a mirror they could not avoid, a reflection that caught them off guard when they thought themselves invulnerable. All the while, I kept my voice steady and my eyes calm when we met. I let them think me harmless, an irrelevant presence. Inside, however, I rehearsed subtle phrases and let them fall into my mental notebook. I would return these phrases later, not as accusations, but as gentle nudges that eventually unspooled into something else. I learned the art of waiting. Waiting is not passive. It is a deliberate use of time, allowing things to mature until they are ripe for skimming off. The more I nourished this inner plan, the less I felt like a victim, and more like a gardener tending to a plot of quiet, inevitable growth. The revenge I imagined was not a thunderclap. It was a slow, corrosive rain that exposed what pride always hides, the frailty beneath the surface sheen. I needed a way to make the past present without screaming it into existence. People believe what is presented as ordinary. I began to introduce small, ordinary evidence into their daily lives. A book left on a bench near their favorite cafe, a casual mention in an online comment, a half-remembered address in a neighborhood directory. These were not elaborate traps. They were breadcrumbs that pointed to a hidden path. Each breadcrumb was ordinary enough to be dismissed at first, but when collected, they formed a pattern. I learned how people rationalize inconvenient information. They create narratives that preserve comfort. My aim was to force them to construct a narrative that included the parts they had chosen to forget. I wanted the daughter and her husband to feel the cognitive dissonance that comes when your tidy life is nudged by fragments that do not fit. I was careful. No threats, no accusations. Only the slow accumulation of truth. One afternoon, I placed a faded receipt in an old coat pocket I knew the daughter sometimes borrowed. The coat had been hanging by her door for years, the fabric softened by seasons. It would go unnoticed for a while, but eventually, in the casual ruffle of getting ready, her fingers would find the paper. I watched her discovery quietly in my mind, imagining the small internal recalibration as the receipt resurfaced. Each small insertion I made was a catalyst for thought. I spoke to mutual acquaintances with the precision of a surgeon. I used language that suggested coincidence rather than intention. People respond to suggestion. I let them overhear that the neighborhood librarian remembered a young girl who once checked out a stack of adventure books and always returned them with notes. I let them see a calendar entry in a public forum that referenced a former school event. The idea was to undermine the neat timeline they had built without confronting it head-on. They began to glance at the past with an uneasy curiosity. Their smiles tightened. I could see their world adjusting like a picture frame on a wall. They were not yet ready to accuse anyone or anything. They were simply aware of a vibration, a slight tremor beneath the surface of the life they thought immutable. That tremor would increase. The threads I had laid would become harder to ignore. It happened on a Sunday, in a room filled with curated warmth. A visit that was meant to be routine turned brittle. I had come with a casserole, the kind of offering that says I still belong at the table even if no one asked me to sit. They accepted it with that practiced hospitality that masks discomfort. The husband asked about nothing in particular, and the daughter laughed with the kind of nervous energy people use to avoid uncomfortable truths. That laugh was a small, ugly thing to me now. I kept my face calm. Inside, I carried the accumulation of small proofs like a ledger. When she left the room to fetch napkins, her phone slid from the counter, and the image of the fallen photograph flashed on its screen. It was a simple picture I had once shown her in passing, a small thing with no tag and no caption. The husband, curious, tapped it open. For a second, the room held its breath. He scrolled down and found a series of images and messages that did not belong in their tidy gallery. The photograph that I cherished had been saved in a social media album with a caption that suggested a different story. Nothing dramatic happened at that instant. There was no shouting, only a tightening of the shoulders, a narrowing of the eyes. The daughter returned and sensed the shift. She asked what had been seen. I answered with a soft, measured honesty, not because I wanted to start a fight, but because I wanted the truth to be undeniable. I spoke of small things that evening without explanation, as if revealing an ordinary detail in a long conversation. People who are certain of their story react to ambiguity the way a mirror reacts to a stone. A crack appears and slowly grows. The fracture did not produce a scene. It produced suspicion. The husband began to look at past choices as if reviewing a film with missing frames. I watched him check his messages with new attention, trace back accounts and dates, as if reconstructing a life from snapshot evidence. The daughter, stunned, retreated into a hollowed silence. The party around them continued like a distant hum. Their guests felt the current, but did not see the fault line beneath their feet. That night, the daughter locked herself away and cried in a way that is private and terrible. I heard the muffled sound through walls and did not move to comfort. I let her be. Comforting would have blurred the line I had managed to make visible. I felt the cold clarity of someone who had set a course and watched it begin to steer itself. Doubt is a subtle poison. It does not necessitate proof to alter behavior. Once doubt takes root, even the most mundane decisions become fraught. I watched them second-guess everything. The authenticity of old photos, the origin of family heirlooms, the veracity of stories told at breakfast. They started to question not only me but themselves and each other. The husband began to re-examine the documents he kept in a neat drawer. The daughter opened old boxes and found letters she had never seen, as if pages had been withheld. I continued with the small intrusions. An old-school report was left in a public archive with a name that matched a different hometown than the one they believed she came from. A former teacher's name surfaced in an online post, mentioning a child with a laugh and a coat with mended elbows. These were ordinary sparks, not fireworks. The point was to create a pattern that required explanation. At first, they blamed technology, old files, mistaken tags. Pride makes people cling to a version of themselves that is flattering. But some doubts have the momentum of avalanches. Once a few rocks loosen, more follow. I could see their confidence eroding. The husband's authoritative manner thinned, and the daughter's casual certainty about family history crumpled into questions. Family portraits were scrutinized with microscopes of suspicion. They asked awkwardly indirect questions in conversation, probing like a surgeon looking for a tumor without calling it by name. The most satisfying moments were not those of confrontation, but the small scenes of private unraveling. The husband checked his phone at odd hours and found his sleep disturbed by meaningless awakenings. The daughter hesitated when answering friends about childhood memories. I watched them both from a distance, as if I were observing two fragile glass figurines, beautiful and easily shattered when pressure is applied in the right place. My revenge had less to do with exposing facts, and more to do with reorienting their sense of certainty. I wanted them to understand that identity built on omission is vulnerable. The revelations were not cruel acts for sport. They were a mirror showing the consequences of constructing life narratives that erase inconvenient truths. Their world became a place where assumptions no longer held. An ordinary dinner turned into a battleground where the ammunition was truth layered in plausible deniability. I went to their table with the composure of a person carrying a comfortable bowl. They did not expect anything dramatic because the pattern of small, unthreatening gestures had put them to sleep. The daughter greeted me with a polite edge and the husband with a strained smile. The party was ongoing upstairs, where laughter tried desperately to be authentic. I spoke about the past in a way that was matter-of-fact. I described errands and routes and an address that had always existed at the edge of their narratives. I mentioned a woman who had once lived 2 blocks from the house they now called their forever. I spoke slowly, naming places and times that seemed ordinary until woven together. The atmosphere changed. The daughter listened with a rigid attention I had not seen for years. The husband's jaw tightened. He asked for specifics I gave without drama. Then something small and precise happened. I produced the photograph I had kept hidden, not as a weapon, but like one presents a family album. The photograph was ordinary in appearance, but heavy with meaning. The daughter traced its edge with the tip of her finger as if touching a relic. The husband's face shifted as he connected the photograph to an unexamined thread of emails and a social media tag. Suddenly, they were both trying to reconcile the evidence with their self-image. They did not shout. They did not accuse loudly. Instead, their anger became internalized, sharp and corrosive. They spoke to each other in low, precise tones. I listened as one might listen to a verdict being read. The daughter asked why no one had told her earlier. The husband asked about motives. I replied with measured honesty about love and care and the practical choices that parents make when protecting a child. I did not dramatize the adoption. I simply stated it, the way one might state the weather. That conversation had the effect I wanted. It did not humiliate them publicly. It forced them to face the ethical architecture of their own life. To feel betrayed, they had to feel the omission deep enough that it reconfigured their memory. The daughter's world shifted in that hush. The husband's steady hand trembled. They retreated from the room, as if the walls themselves had become less reliable. Revelations do not stay private. Once a truth is cracked open, it leaks into networks and communities. Friends who had known only the edited highlights began to receive messages, fragments of stories that raised eyebrows. I did nothing to orchestrate this spread. I left it to the organic hunger of humans to make sense of what they learn. Curiosity is a social magnet. When one person pulls, others feel a gentle tug and investigate. They tried to contain the damage by crafting explanations and offering selective memories that fit the new facts. The husband made statements that sought to reassure. The daughter avoided social gatherings for a while, preferring the safety of small rooms and old photographs. These were natural moves, the instinctive attempts to control narrative. But control is fragile when the foundation is shaken. People started to ask subtle questions in conversation that were like pebbles tossed into still water. Some friends came to me in private seeking clarity. They did not want gossip. They wanted to understand how someone they loved had been kept from a truth that might have mattered. Those conversations did not serve my vengeance. They served the outcome, an altered community perception. The couple watched their social map change. Invitations that once arrived were now cooled by uncertainty. I observed all of this without gloating. My aim was never to annihilate them socially. I wanted recalibration. People who had relied on polishing their image learned that honesty is a demand that ripple effects cannot always ignore. Their marriage, once buoyed by carefully curated stories, had to confront an element that had been intentionally omitted. The ripples touched more than them. They touched the neighbors, the colleagues, the people who had been led to invest in the version of their life that had been sold. By the time their circle had adjusted, they had fewer certainties. They had to rebuild how they narrated their past. Reconstruction is a careful task. Some build stronger on truth. Some simply glue together the old pieces and call it new. They were forced to choose which they would do. After the storm, everything was quieter. There were fewer gatherings, fewer curated snapshots on social media, fewer casual mentions of family lore. The daughter visited occasionally, always with that small, guarded expression that people wear when they are undefined. She would not meet my eyes for long. The husband spoke less when he was present, perhaps because his place in their constructed story had been unsettled. They were not angry in a way that boasted. Their anger had melted into something more telling, a sustained, low disappointment. I did not celebrate. Revenge had not felt like a victory in the way I had imagined on sleepless nights of planning. It felt like a correction, like setting a clock that had been running 5 minutes fast back to time. My satisfaction was subtle and private. It lived in the way I could walk past their house without pretending nothing had happened. It lived in the feeling that my history was no longer negotiable. There were moments of tenderness that surprised me. Once, the daughter left a small note tucked under my doormat, an ordinary scrap where someone had written a clumsy apology in a hand that still held remnants of childhood. She did not ask to be reinstated at the table. She did not demand my forgiveness. She only acknowledged that things were different. That acknowledgement mattered more than any public admission. It suggested that truth, once shared, could soften even hardened edges. Time does something to sharp events. It dulls them. It also clarifies. I learned that revenge's satisfying edge is not in public spectacle, but in the way it forces a reckoning. People who exclude others often do not anticipate waking up in a world where the omission they relied on becomes a question others ask. They are then compelled to reckon with themselves. The aftermath taught me that the goal had been not to destroy, but to demand an honest rearrangement of lives. The final scene was not dramatic. There was no crowning moment of confession on a stage. Instead, there was a slow return to ordinary life with a new geography of truth. They rebuilt their rituals, this time with a careful attention to the seams. The husband learned to listen more honestly to the daughter, and she learned that identity is not something given in a tidy parcel. It is messy and requires work. I watched them from my windows and from the garden where the late roses still bloomed. I kept the photograph in a new place, on the kitchen shelf where it could be seen by anyone who came. It was not a trophy. It was a boundary marker. It said, "This is part of my life, not something to be parceled off or hidden." People sometimes assume revenge seeks to humiliate and humiliate only. But what I wanted was return. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted the truth to occupy the space it deserved. There were times when the daughter stood by the window and looked at the world in a way that suggested she was puzzling through something large and important. We did not have easy conversations, but there was an opening where there had been a locked door. The husband and I never reached a truce. The husband's posture softened in small ways, not with theatrical apologies, but with fewer attempts to control the narrative. My life resumed its rhythms, but it had a subtle firmness I had not had before, a sense that no one could quietly decide the terms of my belonging. I did not tell this story to boast, though telling it now feels like a small lecture in consequence. The revenge I carried out was born of hurt and shaped into something that demanded honesty. It worked because it was patient, because it used ordinary truths like nails to rebuild a crooked fence. People who think they own a story learn, sometimes painfully, that stories have many authors. If this story moved you, please don't forget to give it a like. And if you love emotional, powerful stories like this one, please make sure to subscribe to the channel.